Jake Matthews was running on empty. The 28-year-old marketing manager had been pulling 16-hour days for the past 2 weeks, trying to salvage a campaign that his team had completely botched. His energy drinks were wearing off, his boss was breathing down his neck, and he had exactly 20 minutes to grab groceries before the store closed at midnight. It was a typical Tuesday night in Denver, Colorado, and King Soopers was nearly deserted except for the overnight staff restocking shelves and a few desperate shoppers like himself. Jake grabbed a cart and started speed-walking through the aisles, tossing items into his basket without really looking at prices. Pasta, bread, energy drinks, frozen dinners, whatever would get him through another hellish week at the office. That's when he hit the express lane behind the slowest person on earth. The man ahead of him looked to be in his 50s, wearing faded jeans, worn work boots, and a simple black hoodie. He was methodically counting out exact change for his small purchase, maybe 10 items total, but he was taking forever. Jake could see wrinkled bills and coins spread across the counter as the cashier, a tired-looking teenager, waited patiently. Jake checked his phone. 11:47 p.m. 13 minutes until closing time, and this guy was acting like he had all day. "Come on, man," Jake said loudly, making sure everyone within earshot could hear his frustration. "Some of us have jobs to get back to." The older man glanced back briefly, his eyes meeting Jake's for just a moment. There was something weathered about his face, lines that spoke of years spent outdoors or in difficult conditions. But Jake was too irritated to notice details. "Sorry," the man said quietly, turning back to continue counting his money. "Almost done here." "Almost done." Jake stepped closer, his voice rising. "Dude, you've been counting those quarters for 5 minutes. Don't you have a credit card like a normal person? Or better yet, why don't you shop during normal hours instead of holding up people who actually have responsibilities?" The cashier looked uncomfortable, glancing between the two men. A few other late-night shoppers had stopped to watch the confrontation unfold. The older man's shoulders tensed slightly, but his voice remained calm. "I understand you're in a hurry. I'll be finished in just a moment." "A moment?" Jake laughed harshly. "Look, I don't know what your situation is, but some of us are trying to build careers here. I've got a presentation at 7 a.m. that could make or break my promotion, and I don't have time to watch you dig through your piggy bank for grocery money." The man finally finished counting his change and handed it to the cashier. Jake could see his hands were scarred and calloused, with what looked like an old burn mark across his knuckles. As he gathered his few items, mostly basic necessities like bread, milk, and canned soup, Jake noticed something else. The man was using what appeared to be food stamps for part of his purchase. This was the last straw for Jake. "Seriously?" Jake's voice was loud enough to carry across half the store. "Food stamps? So not only do you not have a real job, but you're making the rest of us pay for your groceries too. And you're too cheap to even tip the cashier for putting up with your slow-motion checkout process." The older man froze, his plastic bags halfway to his cart. For a moment, something dangerous flickered across his features, not anger, exactly, but something harder. Then it was gone, replaced by that same tired patience. "Son," the man said, turning to face Jake fully, "you don't know anything about my situation." "I know enough," Jake shot back. "I know you're shopping at midnight because you probably sleep all day. I know you're paying with food stamps because you can't be bothered to get a real job. And I know you're holding up people who actually contribute to society." A woman in line behind Jake gasped audibly. The teenage cashier looked like she wanted to crawl under the counter. But Jake was on a roll now, months of workplace stress and frustration pouring out. "You know what your problem is?" Jake continued, stepping closer. "Your generation had everything handed to you, and when the economy got tough, you just gave up. Now you expect the government, which means people like me, to take care of you while you shuffle around grocery stores in the middle of the night, counting pocket change." The older man's jaw tightened. He was taller than Jake had initially realized, with broad shoulders that suggested he'd once been in much better shape. There was something in his posture, straight back despite his obvious fatigue, that spoke of military bearing. "You think you know who I am?" the man asked, his voice still quiet but carrying a new edge. "You think you know what I've done with my life?" "I can see what you're doing with your life right now," Jake replied smugly. "Standing in line at midnight, paying for soup with taxpayer money. Real inspiring stuff." The man was silent for a long moment, studying Jake's face with an intensity that was almost unsettling. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "I hope you never have to learn what real hardship looks like, son. I hope you never have to make the kind of choices some of us have had to make." "What choices?" Jake scoffed. "The choice to work or not work. The choice to take responsibility for your life or blame everyone else for your problems. Yeah, those are real tough decisions." The older man picked up his bags, his movements careful and precise. "Take care of yourself, Jake," he said, reading the name off Jake's credit card as he'd handed it to the cashier. "And maybe try to take care of others too." As the men walked away, Jake called after him, "Don't lecture me about taking care of people when you can't even take care of yourself." The men paused at the automatic doors but didn't turn around. Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness of the parking lot. Jake finished his transaction in record time, still fuming about the encounter. The cashier avoided eye contact as she rang up his items, and the other customers in line seemed to be actively avoiding him. But Jake didn't care. He had vented his frustration, and now he could focus on getting home and preparing for tomorrow's presentation. As he loaded his groceries into his BMW, Jake noticed the older man's truck parked under a broken streetlight. It was an old Ford pickup, probably from the early 2000s, with a dented tailgate and faded paint. On the back window, Jake could make out some kind of sticker, but he couldn't see what it said from that distance. Jake drove home to his apartment in Lodo, Denver's trendy downtown district, and tried to put the incident out of his mind. He had bigger things to worry about than some random guy's financial problems. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time Jake closed his eyes, he saw the older man's face, particularly that moment when something had shifted in his expression, when Jake had pushed too far. There had been something in the man's eyes, something that suggested depths Jake hadn't bothered to consider. The next morning's presentation went better than expected. Jake's campaign proposal was approved, and his boss hinted at the promotion he'd been working toward for months. By the time he left the office that evening, Jake had nearly forgotten about the grocery store confrontation. But the universe had other plans. 3 days later, Jake was grabbing lunch at a sandwich shop near his office when he overheard a conversation at the next table. Two men in business suits were discussing a local news story. "Did you see that piece Channel 7 did about the homeless veterans?" one was saying. "Really makes you think about what these guys go through when they come back." "Yeah, I saw that," the other replied. "That guy they interviewed, what was his name?" "Thompson. His story was incredible. Purple Heart recipient, served 3 tours in Iraq, and now he's living in his truck because he can't afford rent on his disability payments." Jake's sandwich suddenly tasted like cardboard. Thompson. Why did that name sound familiar? "What really got me," the first man continued, "was when he talked about how people treat him now. He said the hardest part isn't the PTSD or the injuries, it's the way civilians look at him when they find out he's struggling. Like he's failed somehow, when really he sacrificed everything for this country." Jake pulled out his phone and searched for the Channel 7 story. When the video loaded, his blood turned to ice. There, sitting across from a sympathetic reporter, was the man from the grocery store. But this wasn't the tired, defeated figure Jake had encountered 3 nights ago. This was Staff Sergeant David Thompson, U.S. Army, decorated combat veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. The reporter's voice provided the background. Staff Sergeant Thompson served 3 combat tours in Iraq between 2005 and 2010. During his final deployment, his convoy was hit by an IED, an improvised explosive device. Thompson suffered traumatic brain injury and severe burns to his hands and arms while pulling two fellow soldiers from the burning vehicle, saving their lives. Jake stared at the screen, remembering the scars on the man's hands, the burn marks he'd dismissed without a second thought. After returning home, the reporter continued, Thompson struggled with PTSD and the lasting effects of his brain injury. Despite receiving a Purple Heart and Bronze Star for his service, he found it difficult to maintain steady employment due to his injuries. Earlier this year, he was evicted from his apartment and has been living in his truck while waiting for permanent housing assistance through the VA. The camera zoomed in on Thompson's face as he spoke about his current situation. People see me using food stamps or counting change, and they make assumptions. They don't know that I wake up every morning with a headache that feels like my skull is splitting apart. They don't know that sometimes I lose track of what I'm saying mid-sentence because of the brain injury. They just see someone they think is lazy or worthless. Jake felt physically sick. Every cruel word he'd spoken in that grocery store came flooding back with devastating clarity. The interview continued. Despite his own struggles, Thompson volunteers at the VA hospital twice a week, helping other veterans navigate the benefits system. He also participates in a support group for combat veterans dealing with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. Why do you continue to help others when you're struggling yourself? The reporter asked. Thompson's answer hit Jake like a physical blow, because that's what we do. We take care of each other. It doesn't matter if I'm living in my truck or struggling to pay for groceries, if I can help another veteran get the services they need, then I'm still serving my country. Jake stumbled out of the sandwich shop and sat in his car, hyperventilating. The man he'd humiliated, the hero he'd called worthless, had been struggling with injuries sustained while saving his fellow soldiers' lives. While Jake had been complaining about promotion timelines and presentation deadlines, David Thompson had been dealing with the kind of challenges that would break most people. But it got worse. Jake spent the rest of the day researching David Thompson's military record. What he found painted a picture of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. Thompson had enlisted right out of high school, motivated by the September 11th attacks. During his first tour in Iraq, he'd been part of operations to secure supply routes and protect Iraqi civilians during the early stages of the war. His second tour had been more intense, involving urban combat in Baghdad during the height of the insurgency. Thompson's unit had been responsible for conducting patrols in some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city, where IEDs and sniper attacks were daily occurrences. But it was his third tour that had changed everything. By 2010, Thompson was a squad leader, responsible for the lives of 12 other soldiers. On March 15, 2010, his convoy had been returning from a mission to deliver medical supplies to a rural clinic when the lead vehicle hit a massive IED. The explosion had been devastating. 3 soldiers were killed instantly, and several others were trapped in the burning wreckage. Thompson, despite suffering a severe concussion and burns from the initial blast, had repeatedly run into the flames to pull his men to safety. The official report described Thompson's actions in clinical military language, but Jake could read between the lines. This man had risked his life over and over again, ignoring his own injuries to save others. He'd suffered traumatic brain injury, second- and third-degree burns, and psychological trauma that would affect him for the rest of his life. And Jake had called him worthless. The guilt was overwhelming, but Jake knew he had to do something. He had to find David Thompson and apologize, though he had no idea how to even begin making amends for what he'd done. Jake started by calling the VA hospital, but privacy laws prevented them from giving out any information about Thompson's volunteer schedule. He tried contacting the news station that had done the interview, but they couldn't provide contact information for their subjects. Finally, Jake decided to return to the King's Supers where the confrontation had taken place. He went at the same time, just before midnight, hoping Thompson might be a regular late-night shopper. For 3 nights, Jake waited in the parking lot, feeling increasingly desperate and ashamed. On the 4th night, he saw the familiar Ford pickup pull into the lot. Jake's hands were shaking as he approached Thompson's truck. The veteran was just getting out of the vehicle, moving slowly and carefully. In the better lighting of the parking lot, Jake could see the full extent of the scarring on Thompson's hands and forearms, evidence of the burns he'd sustained while saving his fellow soldiers. "Mr. Thompson." Jake called out, his voice cracking slightly. Thompson turned, and recognition flickered across his face. For a moment, Jake thought the veteran might simply walk away, and Jake wouldn't have blamed him. Instead, Thompson stood his ground, waiting. I saw the news story," Jake managed to say. "I know who you are now. What you did. What you've been through." Thompson's expression remained neutral. And I'm sorry," Jake said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm so incredibly sorry for what I said to you, how I treated you. I had no right." "You had every right," Thompson interrupted, his voice tired but not unkind. "You have the right to speak your mind. That's one of the things I fought for. But I was horrible to you. I called you worthless, made assumptions about your life. You saw someone struggling and made judgments based on limited information," Thompson said. "It happens more than you'd think." Jake felt tears building behind his eyes. "How can you be so calm about this? I humiliated you in front of strangers. I said things that were inexcusable." Thompson was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face in the fluorescent parking lot lights. When he spoke, his voice was gentler. "Jake, right? I remember your name from your credit card." Jake nodded. "Jake, do you know what I learned in Iraq?" Jake shook his head. "I learned that everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. The insurgents we fought, some of them were kids who'd watched their families get killed in crossfire. Some of my fellow soldiers who seemed tough as nails were dealing with problems back home that would destroy most people. Everyone's carrying something." Thompson gestured toward the grocery store. "That night, you were clearly stressed about something. Probably work, maybe personal stuff. You took it out on me because I was an easy target, someone you perceived as being lower on the social ladder. It wasn't right, but it was human." "That doesn't excuse what I did," Jake insisted. "No, it doesn't," Thompson agreed. "But it explains it. And explanation can be the first step toward doing better." They stood in silence for a moment, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate providing a backdrop to their conversation. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said finally. Thompson nodded. "Why didn't you tell me about your service that night? Why didn't you defend yourself?" Thompson's smile was sad but genuine. "Because my worth as a person isn't determined by what I did in the military. It's determined by how I treat people today, right here, right now. If I'd told you about my service record just to make you feel bad, what would that have accomplished?" "It would have shut me up," Jake said. "Maybe. But it wouldn't have changed your heart. You'd have been sorry for disrespecting a veteran, not for disrespecting another human being." Jake was crying now, not caring who might see. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make it right." Thompson reached out and put a scarred hand on Jake's shoulder. "You start by treating the next person you meet with kindness, especially if they're struggling. You stop making assumptions about people based on how much money they have or what their circumstances look like. You remember that everyone has a story, and most of those stories involve more pain than you can imagine." "Is there anything I can do for you specifically?" Jake asked. "Any way I can help?" Thompson thought for a moment. "There is, actually. There are a lot of veterans in this city who are struggling with homelessness, unemployment, PTSD. Most of them don't need pity, they need practical help. Job connections, someone to drive them to medical appointments, help navigating the VA bureaucracy. If you really want to make amends, help one of them." Over the following weeks, Jake threw himself into learning about veteran issues in Denver. He volunteered at the VA hospital, helped organize job fairs specifically for veterans, and even used his marketing skills to create promotional materials for veteran support organizations. But more importantly, Jake changed how he interacted with people in his daily life. He stopped making assumptions about the homeless man he passed on his way to work each morning and started buying him coffee and asking about his day. He learned the man's name was Carlos, that he was a Navy veteran struggling with alcohol addiction, and that he had 2 kids he hadn't seen in 5 years. Jake began carrying grocery store gift cards to give to people he saw using food stamps, not out of pity but out of recognition that everyone deserves dignity when meeting their basic needs. He started leaving generous tips for service workers and treating every interaction as an opportunity to practice kindness. 3 months after the grocery store incident, Jake received a call that changed his perspective even further. It was from David Thompson. "Jake, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the VA, you've been volunteering there, and people have noticed." "Of course, Mr. Thompson. What can I do for you?" "Well, I wanted to let you know that I've been accepted into a transitional housing program. I'll be moving into an apartment next week." Jake felt a surge of happiness for the veteran. "That's incredible news. Congratulations." "Thank you. But that's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because I heard about what you've been doing, the volunteer work, the way you've been helping other veterans. People are talking about it." Jake felt embarrassed. "I'm just trying to do better. Trying to make up for." "You're not making up for anything," Thompson interrupted. "You're becoming the person you were meant to be. That night in the grocery store, that wasn't who you really are. It was who you were when you were overwhelmed and frustrated. This volunteer work, this kindness you're showing people, this is who you really are." Jake was quiet, absorbing Thompson's words. "I wanted to tell you something else," Thompson continued. "That night, after you yelled at me, I went home and sat in my truck feeling pretty low about myself. I started thinking maybe you were right, maybe I was worthless, maybe I was just a burden on society." Jake's heart sank. "Mr. Thompson, let me finish. I was in a dark place, wondering if things would ever get better. But then I remembered something my squad leader used to tell us in Iraq: every day above ground is a gift, and what we do with that gift determines who we are. I decided that night to keep fighting, to keep trying to help other veterans, to keep believing that things could get better." Thompson paused, and when he continued, his voice was emotional. "Jake, I want you to know that watching you change, seeing you turn that moment of anger into years of service to others, it's given me hope. If someone can transform that completely, if someone can choose to be better every single day, then maybe there's hope for all of us." Jake was crying again, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than shame. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be better." "Thank you for taking it," Thompson replied. A year later, Jake received an invitation that meant more to him than any promotion or professional achievement ever could. David Thompson was getting married to a woman he'd met in his PTSD support group, another veteran who understood his struggles. The ceremony was small, held in a community center with mostly fellow veterans in attendance. Jake almost didn't go, feeling like he didn't belong among Thompson's real friends and family. But Thompson had personally asked him to be there, saying, "You're part of my story now, Jake." The good part. During the reception, Thompson pulled Jake aside for a quiet conversation. "I never properly thanked you," Thompson said. Jake was confused. "Thanked me? For what?" "For helping me remember who I was," Thompson replied. "That night in the grocery store, I felt invisible, forgotten. Like the country I'd served had written me off. But watching you change, seeing you dedicate yourself to helping other veterans, it reminded me that my service mattered, that my story mattered, that I mattered." Thompson gestured toward his new wife, who was laughing with a group of veteran friends. "I might never have had the courage to open my heart again if I hadn't seen that people can change, that second chances are real. Jake thought about everything that had led to this moment, his anger and frustration that night, his cruel words, the shame and guilt that followed, and the long journey toward becoming a better person. "Mr. Thompson," Jake said, "can I ask you one more question?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret not telling me about your service that night? Do you wish you'd put me in my place when you had the chance?" Thompson smiled, the same patient expression he'd worn throughout all their interactions. "Jake, if I'd told you about my medals and my service record that night, you might have apologized for disrespecting a veteran. But you never would have learned to stop disrespecting people in general. You never would have become the man you are today." As Jake drove home from the wedding, he thought about the long journey from that midnight confrontation to this moment of celebration. He thought about all the veterans he'd met through his volunteer work, all the assumptions he'd learned to question, all the moments when he'd chosen kindness over judgment. The grocery store where it all began was on his route home. Jake pulled into the parking lot and sat in his car for a moment, remembering that night when two strangers had collided in mutual frustration and pain. One of those strangers had chosen to respond with grace and patience, even when he'd been wronged. The other had eventually chosen to transform his shame into service. Together, they proved that redemption was possible, that people could change, and that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can become the catalysts for becoming our best selves. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Carlos, the homeless Navy veteran Jake had befriended. "Got the job at the warehouse. Start Monday. Thanks for believing in me." Jake smiled and typed back, "I knew you could do it. Proud of you, brother." As he drove away from the grocery store, Jake reflected on the man he'd been that night and the man he was becoming. The transformation wasn't complete, probably never would be, but every day offered new opportunities to choose kindness over judgment, understanding over assumption, service over selfishness. David Thompson had taught him that everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. But more than that, he'd taught Jake that everyone deserves the chance to fight that battle with dignity, respect, and the support of their community. It had taken a moment of cruelty to teach Jake the value of compassion. It had taken encountering a true hero to realize that heroism wasn't about grand gestures or medals, it was about choosing to be better, one interaction at a time, one day at a time, one person at a time. And Jake chose to be better. Don't forget to like the videos and subscribe to the channel for more short stories.